And, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind.
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
Ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
downloaded to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
and I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
All right. Thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And yeah, we're going to get back to your host.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. There's a lot of different time zones about the place. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon where I am, which is the north of England. It's 11 a.m. on the east coast in the States, and you're listening to Free Association on Revolution Radio. My name's Dennis Barker, and what I'm going to do today is talk for a little bit and then play some videos about Aldous Huxley. Well, I've got a video lined up, which is a speech he gave in California in 1962. So I'm going to do that later on. It's about 45 minutes, and we'll see how that goes. So the reason I picked Aldous Huxley is because there's a blue plaque on the wall next to where I buy my groceries in Newcastle. Blue plaques are to commemorate significant people and events in the world of, usually the world of culture or history or the arts or something similar. So what it says on that plaque is that Aldous Huxley visited a friend in 1904, I think it was, off the top of my head, and the friend had moved, so he wasn't able to get in touch with the friend, and this is a plaque commemorating the visit of Aldous Huxley to this particular place in Newcastle. I find it a little bit bizarre that they would do something like that, but obviously it's got a name. It's a named person. He's a well-known person, and Newcastle clearly wants to associate with the person. To me, it's a bit bizarre, but because it's a non-event. He visited a friend who'd already moved from the place that he thought he lived. The friend wasn't available because he'd gone. So Aldous Huxley was probably literally at that spot for about, how long would you wait until you found out a friend had moved? Maybe 5-10 minutes? Less if you're speaking to somebody who lives there, who's taking over the responsibility for the apartment or whatever. But it seems a little bit bizarre to me that they would do that. But nevertheless, it's there, and it's inspired me to do a show about Aldous Huxley, so it's not completely wasted. I'm wondering who put it there, though. It must be the council must have agreed to it, and probably the Arts Council or one of those places has funded it. It's a strange situation, but there you go. Aldous Huxley, if you don't know, wrote Brave New World, in which he describes a world where babies are grown in large tubes. So there is no sex between people. It's all done in a laboratory or a factory, and the world is kind of controlled by an elite group who control and manage the population by using drugs that change their mood. It just sounds quite familiar, except that we don't directly connect the drugs with the elite in the world that we're in today. But there's clear evidence of heroin. Well, heroin trade has been going on through the East India Company, through the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, through trade from China to Britain, and via the CIA from Afghanistan and Vietnam or whatever into the United States. So the principle is there. The same principle's operating now. It's just being done a little bit more covertly than it was in the 19th century. So the trade's gone underground, the finance has gone underground, whereas in the 19th century in the British Empire, it was open and nobody worried about it too much. It was just trade. So let's see if we can get this Aldous Huxley piece up and running. So I'm going to double check that I'm being heard in the chat room, because I think that's a good idea. All right, I am being heard. That's good. So I'm going to play this piece. It's about 45 minutes long, but I think it's worth playing. There we go. Ultimate Revolution. This is on BitChute. Let's give you the channel. If you just look up Aldous Huxley on BitChute, it's on Glow Radio's channel. Right, so I'll give them credit for it. I may not play the whole thing, but the stuff I've been listening to about Aldous Huxley's been worth playing. So I'm just going to let it play until I decide not to.
Didn't attend, and one 2 years ago where there was a considerable discussion on this subject. At Santa Barbara, we were talking about technology in general and the effects it's likely to have on society and the problems related to technological transplanting of technology into underdeveloped countries. Today, we are faced, I think, with the approach of what may be called the ultimate revolution, the final revolution, where man can act directly on the mind-body of his fellows. Well, needless to say, some kind of direct action on human mind-bodies has been going on since the beginning of time. But this has generally been of a violent nature. The techniques of terrorism have been known from time immemorial, and people
Right,
employ
try this again from
with more or less.
Yes. Do this again. Give me 2 seconds. The sound on my laptop's never good enough for some reason, but we'll just do it from the phone instead. Right, so we're on BitChute. Right, now where's my search bar? Honestly, there we go. It's all hidden away on Aldous Huxley. There is a version of there's at least one version of Brave New World on BitChute as well, if people are interested in. Actually, there's the audio book and there's a couple of movies, so there's plenty of different versions of Brave New World on there. This is the Berkeley speech. Right, okay, so for some reason I can do that on my laptop, but I can't do it on the mobile, so I don't understand that. Makes no real sense. But I've got a 10-minute clip that I can play instead, so it's alright.
This is Aldous Huxley, a man haunted by a vision of hell on earth. A searing social critic, Mr. Huxley, 27 years ago, wrote Brave New World, a novel that predicted that someday the entire world would live under a frightful dictatorship. Today, Mr. Huxley says that his fictional world of horror is probably just around the corner for all of us. We'll find out why in a moment.
In his 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman offers an analytical contrast between literary giants George Orwell, author of dystopian classic 1984, and Aldous Huxley, author of dystopian classic Brave New World. Writes Postman, quote, "What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one." In the global political climate of 2019, the proverbial knife's edge of revolution, where the only two outcomes that seem to remain plausible are the breakthrough of man to higher purpose or the complete and irreversible swallowing of freedom by a throbbing shadow oligarchy of dusty British boy lovers. Continues Postman, Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared we would become a captive audience. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. The thematic similarity between Orwell and Huxley's two great dystopian novels is no accident, and it is Huxley, not Orwell, who gets the credit. Whereas George Orwell published 1984, in the actual year 1949, Huxley had written Brave New World a full 18 years earlier in 1931. Huxley had also taught French for a year at Eton College before becoming a successful writer, and of all people, one of his students was a young Englishman named Eric Blair, who would go on to write under the nom de plume George Orwell. Finishes Postman, quote, Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate would ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us.
Tonight's guest, Aldous Huxley, is a man of letters, as disturbing as he is distinguished. Born in England, now a resident of California, Mr. Huxley has written some of the most electric novels in social criticism of this century. So, Mr. Huxley, right off the bat, let me ask you this. As you see it, who and what are the enemies of freedom here in the United States?
Well, I don't think you can say who in the United States. I don't think there are any sinister persons deliberately trying to rob people of their freedom. But I do think, first of all, that there are a number of impersonal forces which are pushing in the direction of less and less freedom. And I also think that there are a number of technological devices which anybody who wishes to use can use to accelerate this process of going away from freedom, of imposing control.
While George Orwell remains a staple of pop culture, and the vision laid out in 1984 of a gray, bleak prison of suppression and censorship remains so well known that megacorporations have lived long enough to both profit from, then literally become, its nightmare.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1985.
Lesser studied and thus less understood is the vision of Orwell's own mentor and sage, who saw us descending into decadence, not poverty. A global abandonment of individuality and personal responsibility would lead to enslavement by our desires, not our fears. But interestingly, and to the argument of the almost mystical importance of paradox, time may have proven that in fact both are happening together and separately at the same time. And what I might suggest is that Orwell's vision has crept upon the masses, we the proletariat, those ill-equipped to resist the crushing burden of litigious warfare and the abuse of political authority. To lift may be the most over and misused analogy of all time. The lower class is in effect the quanta of the human universe, and so is at the mercy of constant uncertainty, never really real or meaningful until pigeonholed as particle or wave by meddling observer. And yet at the same time, and strangely to our relief, the creepy decadence of our oppressors, their ritual worship of the God within, and their suspected cultish pursuit of a parasitic immortality for which they have no understanding, these large-scale classical forces, equal and opposite reactions, and the infinite wingspan of karmic gravitation are inexorably dragging them across the event horizon of their long-since superdetermined personal singularity of hell. The full 1958 interview of Aldous Huxley, which is about 30 minutes long, can be watched using the link in the description. I'd like to close out this Sunday video with some final thoughts from the author himself on a topic possibly more relevant now than ever: communism and technology.
One sees here a pattern which seems to be pushing very strongly towards a totalitarian regime. And unfortunately, as in all these underdeveloped countries, the only highly organized political party is the Communist Party. It looks rather as though they will be the heirs to this unfortunate process. I mean, let us take, after all, a piece of very recent and very painful history is the propaganda used by Hitler, which was incredibly effective. I mean, what were Hitler's methods? Hitler used terror on the one kind, brute force on the one hand, but he also used a very efficient form of propaganda. He didn't have TV, but he had the radio, which he used to the fullest extent, and was able to impose his will on an immense mass of people. I mean, the Germans were highly educated people.
Well, we're aware of all this, but how do you equate Hitler's use of propaganda with the way that propaganda, if you will, is used, let us say, here in the United States? Are you suggesting that there's a parallel?
Needless to say, it's not being used in this way now. But the point is, it seems to me, that there are methods at present available, methods superior in some respects to Hitler's method, which could be used in a bad situation. What I see very strongly is that we mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history, with technology has advanced, and this changes social conditions, and suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do.
Well, now, what do you mean? Do you mean that we develop our television, but we don't know how to use it correctly? Is that the point that you're making?
Well, at present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. It's being used, I think, I would feel it's being used too much to distract everybody all the time. But, I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries, where the television, where it exists, is always saying the the same thing the whole time. It's always driving along. It's not creating a wide front of distraction. It's creating a one-pointed drumming in of a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument. So.
That's it for today. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe.
There we go. So that was Aldous Huxley from 1958. I took that from BitChute on the John Ward's channel. For whatever reason, it wouldn't let me play the other video, so I've got that. And Huxley was an intellectual, obviously, thoughtful about what he was thinking, what he was saying, and knowledgeable and well educated. You don't get to be a French teacher at Eton without having connections or without knowing your stuff and having connections. So he was part of the group of families that were involved. His brother, I think, was involved with the League of Nations, and his father was an advocate of Darwinism in the early days of Darwinism, or his grandfather. So the family's got connections in all those kind of ways to the British establishment. Right, I'm going to see if I can find the video that I wanted to play, which is Dancing Shiva, Aldous Huxley. This is about 7 minutes long as well, so this is no, I'll have to do that from YouTube. Give me 2 seconds.
Which is essential. Doesn't take staggering symbols that the Indians produced. I mean, the dancing Shiva, for example, we've never produced anything as comprehensive as this. The dancing Shiva, those little bronze statues. It is the Shiva with 4 arms dancing with 1 foot raised. And, well, I mean, I go into the details, they're really quite extraordinary. It's the figure stands within a great circle, sort of halo, which has flames going out, I mean, the symbols of flames. And this is the circle of mass, energy, space, time. I mean, this is the material world, the great world of the all-embracing material world with its flames. Within this, Shiva dances. He's called Nataraja, the lord of the dance. And he dances, he's everywhere in the universe. I mean, this is his dance. The manifestation of the world is called his lila, his play. So, I mean, he sends his rain upon the just and the unjust, and he's beyond good and evil, of course. It's all an immense manifestation of play. He has this long hair, which is the hair of the yogi, contemplative, and it streams out to the limits of the universe, you see. Therefore, this sort of yogic knowledge of this contemplation includes everything. He has 4 arms. In the upper right arm, he holds a little drum, which is the drum which summons things into creation. You beat upon this drum, things come into existence. In his left arm, he holds a fire, which is what destroys everything. He both creates and destroys. His lower right hand is held up in this attitude, which means be not afraid, in spite of everything, it is all right. The other hand points down at his feet, and 1 foot is planted squarely on the back of a repulsive dwarf, this infinitely powerful dwarf called Muyalaka, I think his name is, who is the ego. And he has to break the back of the ego, you see. What he's really pointing at is the other foot, which is raised. And this means this foot is raised against gravitation and is the symbol of spiritual contemplation. The whole thing is there, you see. I mean, the world of space and time and matter and energy, the world of creation and destruction, the world of psychology. I mean, how do you get out of this? I mean, if you don't break the back of the ego, you're lost. And if you don't practice contemplation, there will be no liberation for you. I mean, we don't have anything remotely approaching such a comprehensive symbol, which is both cosmic and psychological and spiritual. I mean, it is really most unfortunate that we have such miserable symbols. It's part of the regular Hinduism, but it is specifically Shivaite. And then one of the manifestations, of course, is called Bhairava of Shiva, who is also dancing, but he dances in cemeteries. And I mean, to remind us that the dance of life isn't always very jolly. I mean, that he dances just as much in misery and death as in life and elation. I mean, this has to be accepted. And of course, again, it's only by the lifted foot that we can accept it. I mean, it actually is completely compatible with the modern scientific idea. I mean, it includes the world, you see, of mass, energy, space, and time. And the idea of the infinite energy dancing timelessly and forever through this world, dancing through human mentality too. I mean, the world is felt to be, of course, a kind of outrage, because the play goes on even inside ourselves, although we are sentient beings, and yet the hand is raised, everything is finally all right in spite of everything, if, as Buddha says, I show you sorrow and the ending of sorrow. The ending of sorrow is putting your foot on the back of the dwarf and raising the other foot against gravity into the state of contemplation. I mean, the whole thing is there, stated in this single, extremely elegant. I mean, these Shiva images from the south of India are very, very elegant. They're most beautiful pieces of sculpture, the best of them. But it's a shame we don't have any good symbols like this to remind us of who we are and of what we can do about it, if anything. No, we're very, very poor in it. I mean, we have some of the Christians say, look, they're not really satisfactory. I mean, the symbol of the cross is fairly good, but it doesn't take into account the sort of cosmic side of life. I mean, it doesn't take into account mass, energy, space, and time, which is essential. It doesn't take into account, I mean, as it stands, it doesn't take into account the importance of contemplation. No, I mean, there are other symbols, of course, within Christianity which do, but a single comprehensive symbol like the Shiva symbol we do not have, and it's very unfortunate. This whole business of the organized manipulation of symbols is, I mean, the human mind is a symbolific instrument. I mean, it exists to manufacture symbols, to turn immediate experience into symbols for the purpose of managing it in a fairly convenient way. The question is, can we get on with fairly scientific symbols, realistic symbols, and then concentrate on the immediate experience? I don't know. I mean, I simply don't know whether this is possible as a sort of general attitude towards the world. I think it's certainly possible in isolated individuals, but whether in fact it will ever turn out to be something which appeals to great numbers of people, I have no idea.
All right, so that particular clip was from July 1961. There are other clips on here that are probably worth playing. And Aldous Huxley and Neville Goddard knew each other, which is one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in Aldous Huxley, because they wrote to each other at least once. Neville Goddard has spoken about that in his lectures. So Neville Goddard also knew Israel Regardie, who was an occultist, Kabbalist. So all these types of people know each other because they're interested in the same things. It's not necessarily a conspiracy, it's just because they're interested in the same things. And yeah, let me see if I can find another clip of Huxley.
It's a question of education to teach people to be on their guard against the sort of verbal booby traps into which they're always being led, to analyze the kind of things that are said to them. I think it's terribly important to insist on the individual values, that every human being is unique. And it is, of course, on this genetical basis that the whole idea of the value of freedom is based.
This is Aldous Huxley, a man haunted by a vision of hell on earth. Mr. Huxley wrote Brave New World, a novel that predicted that someday the entire world would live under a frightful dictatorship. Today, Mr. Huxley says that his fictional world of horror is probably just around the corner for all of us.
There are a number of impersonal forces which are pushing in the direction of less and less freedom. The first of them can be called overpopulation. The whole essence of biological life on Earth is a question of balance, and what we have done is to practice death control in a most intensive manner without balancing this with birth control at the other end. In the underdeveloped countries, people have less to eat and less goods, and the central government has to take over more and more responsibility for keeping the ship of state on an even keel. And then, of course, you're likely to get social unrest under such conditions, with again an intervention of the central government. One sees here a pattern which seems to be pushing very strongly towards a totalitarian regime.
Are there specific devices or methods of communication which diminish our freedoms?
Well, there are certainly devices which can be used in this way. Hitler used terror on the one kind, brute force on the one hand, but he also used a very efficient form of propaganda. He had the radio, which he used to the fullest extent, and was able to impose his will on an immense mass of people. I mean, the Germans were a highly educated people. We mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history. And suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do. At present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. But I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries, where the television, where it exists, is always saying the same thing the whole time. It's always driving along. It's drumming in of a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument.
Right, that's a variation on the same clip, so I'm not going to keep playing that. There's a 10-minute summary of Brave New World that I can play, so let's just do that.
Brave New World is about a futuristic society that has tried to create a perfect community where everyone is happy. They use science to mass produce people and condition them to do and want only the things they're supposed to. But in doing that, they take away freedoms, like the freedom to think for oneself. The few characters we see who do think for themselves aren't happy, so the novel poses a question. Is it better to be happy or free? The book starts with the director of the Central London Hatching and Conditioning Center explaining to a group of students how they create people, since women don't actually get pregnant anymore. Eggs are fertilized and then undergo a process that causes the fertilized eggs to divide. They can get up to 96 identical twins from a single fertilized egg this way. The director brings the group into one of the conditioning rooms. Nurses lay out flowers and books and then bring in a group of babies. Then they shock the babies through an electrified strip in the floor. Over time, the babies will learn to instinctively dislike books and nature. These babies are deltas, one of the society's lower castes, and the lower castes perform non-intellectual jobs like factory work. By conditioning the delta babies to hate books, the society ensures that they will never have any desire for them, and by conditioning them to hate flowers and nature, they'll want to stay near their work in the cities. They condition all the castes this way, according to what their role will be in the community. The group continues into an outdoor garden, where several hundred naked children are engaged in erotic play. This play conditions the children to grow up feeling comfortable being sexually promiscuous. The group runs into Mustafa Mond, a very powerful man and one of the 10 world controllers. He tells them what it was like in the past, when mothers gave birth to children and people grew up in families, and adults still paired off into monogamous couples. Everyone is really grossed out by the idea of mothers and families. The story cuts to Lenina and Bernard. Bernard is a psychologist. Even though he's a member of the highest caste, he feels like an outsider because he's smaller and looks different than most men in his caste. He likes Lenina, but it bothers him that she acts like everyone else. He and Lenina are planning a trip to a savage reservation in New Mexico, but tonight she has a date with Henry Foster. Lenina leaves for her date, and a man named Benito Hoover walks over and talks about how attractive Lenina is. Bernard gets annoyed, so Benito offers him Soma, which is a drug that everyone takes to feel happy and kind of stoned. Bernard just turns and walks away. Bernard picks up his friend, Helmholtz Watson. Helmholtz feels he has something important inside him that he wants to let out through his writing, but he doesn't know what it is or how to write it. Bernard and Helmholtz both feel like they're different. This shared sense of being different creates a bond between them. That night, Bernard attends Solidarity Service, which is kind of like church. All the people sing hymns together and praise their prophet and await the coming of a greater being. The prophet they're praising is Henry Ford, who introduced the assembly line and revolutionized mass production. And they all take Soma to feel like they're dissolving into one unified whole. Finally, they break out into dance, then dim the lights and have an orgy, while a voice has a refrain that begins with the phrase, orgy porgy. Lenina remembers the first time she and Bernard went out together. He stopped their helicopter over the English Channel to watch the waves below. He said the sea made him feel like he was an individual. Lenina felt shocked and angry with him, so Bernard gave up and took her back to his apartment, where they took Soma and had sex. Bernard goes to the director of the Hatching and Conditioning Center to get permission to visit the Savage Reservation in New Mexico. The director gets upset, and he tells Bernard about his own trip to the reservation many years earlier. He went with a woman, and on the last day of their trip, they rode horses up a mountain. After lunch, he took a nap, and when he woke up, she was gone. A terrible thunderstorm broke out, and the lightning scared the horses. He hurt his knee trying to catch them, but they ran off. The next day, they searched for the woman, but she was never found. He ends the meeting by telling Bernard he's very unhappy with Bernard's behavior, and threatens to relocate him to Iceland. Bernard and Lenina go to the Savage Reservation, and witness a ritual where a young man must remain silent while he's whipped. The square empties out, and a young savage approaches Bernard and Lenina. Unlike the others, he's white, and he speaks English. This savage, whose name is John, wanted to be whipped, to prove he's a man and to sacrifice his body for the village. He explained that his mother, Linda, wasn't from the reservation. She had been visiting with a man, and while on a walk in the mountains, she fell down a ravine and hit her head. Some hunters from the village found her and carried her back. She was already pregnant with John, who was born and raised in the village. Bernard remembers the director's story. John takes them to see his mother. She's thrilled to see civilized people and tells them how awful it is on the reservation, with the women having babies all the time, and the people pair off into couples and only have sex with that person. Outside, John tells Bernard about his childhood in the village. His mother often got drunk and slept with a man named Popeye. John hated him, and he remembers the time when some of the village women held his mother down and whipped her because she kept sleeping with their husbands. But Linda taught John to read, and one day Popeye brought him a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare. John read the book all the time because he loved the language and to deal with his loneliness. Bernard invites John to come back to London with them, and he says Linda can come too. He knows he can use her as leverage against the director. Lena feels so stressed from everything that she takes a bunch of Soma and spends a day asleep. John comes looking for Bernard and finds her there. He's been in love with her since he first saw her. He wants to touch her, but he won't allow himself to. They all arrive back in London, and Bernard is called to come see the director at work. The director announces that to keep Bernard from infecting others with his unorthodoxy, he's sending him to Iceland. But Bernard calls Linda in, and she immediately recognizes the director, and says that she had a baby because of him. John comes in and falls to his knees in front of the director, calling him my father over and over. The director is horrified. It's obscene to talk about pregnancy, and shameful to be called a father. And all the workers laugh hysterically like it's all a dirty joke, until the director runs out of the room. Bernard starts to show John what life in London is like, and John becomes instantly famous. His celebrity makes Bernard popular too. Linda, meanwhile, does nothing but lie in bed and take Soma. One evening, Lenina takes John to the Feelies, which are like movies that engage all the senses, so you can actually feel and smell what's happening. The Feelie involves a lot of casual sex, and afterward, they go back to Lenina's apartment. But John is unhappy. He leaves, and Lenina still can't understand why he won't sleep with her. On the night of Bernard's biggest party, which several important officials have agreed to attend, John refuses to come out of his room. Bernard has to tell all his guests that the Savage won't be appearing. The guests are furious. During his brief popularity, Bernard had stopped speaking with Helmholtz Watson. But he goes to see Helmholtz after his public embarrassment, and the two become friends again. When Helmholtz and John meet, they're instantly close. Helmholtz, who's been trying to express his emotions through rhymes, hears Shakespeare for the first time. John's refusal to sleep with Lenina has Lenina thinking of him constantly. Finally, she decides to act and goes to his apartment. She marches in, and when John mentions marriage, she's horrified. She decides to take her clothes off and get him into bed. He becomes enraged and calls her a whore. Lenina runs into the bathroom to hide. John gets a phone call about his mother and leaves. Linda is at the hospital, and as John tries to speak to her, she keeps dozing off because she's on a high dose of soma. Making the situation worse, several young boys who are in the room for death conditioning keep gawking at her. Then Linda dies, and as John rushes out of the room, he shoves one of the boys over in a rage. In the hospital's vestibule, John runs into a group of workers getting their soma rations. He freaks out and starts shouting that soma is poison. He says they're all slaves, and he's going to make them free. Then he starts throwing the soma out the window. Bernard and Helmholtz get a call and go to find John at the hospital. When they get there, a brawl is going on. Helmholtz jumps in to help John, while Bernard basically can't decide what to do. John, Bernard, and Helmholtz are brought to Mustafa Mond, who explains to them why old things like Shakespeare are prohibited. First, society needs people to want new things, not old ones. People have to keep buying and consuming for the sake of the economy. You also can't write or understand tragedies without social instability, and social instability no longer exists. They've made everyone happy, and engineered a perfect society where everyone plays a role exactly suited to their desires and abilities. Mond says sometimes people don't fit in their roles. He was one of those people. He had the choice of being sent away to an island or joining a program to become a world controller. Bernard and Helmholtz are going to be sent to islands with other people who don't fit in. Bernard freaks out and is escorted from the room. Helmholtz goes to check on him, and Mond and John keep talking. Mond says they've also gotten rid of God. God and religion are only compatible with a society where people get old and suffer losses. God and religion also lead to self-denial. But modern industrial civilization only works when people indulge every desire. It keeps people buying things, and it keeps them from ever feeling any real passion or frustration, which can lead to instability. When they do feel something, they have soma to keep them happy. John says he doesn't like it. He would rather be free to suffer losses, get sick, and grow old. So Bernard and Helmholtz are sent to different islands, and John goes to live in a deserted lighthouse in the countryside. He enjoys living alone, but he thinks he enjoys it too much, so he whips himself as punishment. Crowds and reporters start turning up at the lighthouse, demanding that the Savage do his whipping stunt. Eventually, a huge crowd appears, and they end up beating one another in front of John's house while chanting "Orgy Porgy." When John wakes up the next day, he remembers everything and feels horrified. When the crowd comes back that night, they find him hanging. For more information about Brave New World, check out the Brave New World SparkNote at sparknotes.com.
There you go, there's the summary. I've not seen the films and I've not read the book, but a lot of what's in there is already subliminally in society anyway. Soma, if you're taking it on a regular basis, would be tranquilizers or antidepressants or any combination of pharmaceutical drugs that numbs pain, I would expect. So he's talking about the pharmaceutical industry. He's talking about television. Television numbs pain. It's a distraction that pulls people out of suffering. So these things are already built into society. They weren't at the time we wrote the book, but the equivalents of them are now. And I think we're more in the Brave New World society than we are in George Orwell, at least at the moment. As soon as there's a war, of course, that becomes more obvious. But the propaganda is there. the endless wars are there. So that it's a combination of the two really going on. But again, I don't want to live in a science fiction dystopia. So my head has to be somewhere else. So even if that's happening on the outside, even if it is in society, I can acknowledge it. I can accept that things are going on that are the equivalent, but I don't have to live there. I can choose to have my consciousness in a different place. And I'm not in the business of fighting people. I'm not in the business of confronting people about stuff. So I'll just take my consciousness to the place that I want to live at, and I'll ignore most of what's going on around me. So my strategy basically is denial, but that seems to be working for me at the moment. So I'm not going to argue with it. If as long as it's working reasonably well, I've got stuff to sort out that I've been ignoring for way too long. But most of what's going on at the moment, I can quite happily ignore and just get on with my life. Where do I take this? So the idea of Shiva, dancing Shiva, dancing in life and in death, is a connection to what I said last week about Reiki being universal life force and where is the death force. So Shiva is dancing in life and in death. It's universal life and the death force as well. So that connection I liked. That's one of the reasons that I picked that video to play today. And you're listening to Revolution Radio, which is entirely listener supported. So if you do have $5 or $10 in your back pocket that you can spare, or if you're interested in making a regular donation, there's a chance to do that at revolution.radio. You can become a patron, or you can make a one-off donation, or there's merchandise you can buy there as well. All of which helps to keep the servers running. There's 2 servers running 24 hours a day. Studio B is filling up quite nicely now. Studio A is already full. And there's a lot of good stuff on there. I seem to be staying up till about 3 o'clock in the morning at the moment, listening to Revolution Radio. And I need to get back to doing the archives because I can't do 3 o'clock in the morning on a regular basis and still have a morning the next day. So anyway, that's pretty much that. Let's see if I've got another video that I can play for the next 5 minutes or so. Because there's a summary of 1984 on here as well, so let's do that.
Is about totalitarianism. A totalitarian government is one that tries to control every aspect of life. How people spend every minute of their time, even in private, who they can associate with, what they're allowed to say. A totalitarian government even tries to control what people think and what they believe. George Orwell wrote 1984 in the late 1940s. What he knew about totalitarianism was based on the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Those governments had come into being not that long before, and they weren't very well understood yet. What Orwell was trying to do with 1984 was to give his readers a clear picture of what life would be like if a free country like England were under totalitarian rule. 1984 takes place in London. The London in the book is a depressing place. There's never enough to eat, the food's disgusting, there aren't enough clothes or shoes or anything to go around, and the city is pretty dilapidated, except for these giant pyramid-shaped government buildings that rise above the landscape. There's some sort of war going on, though no one really understands what it's about. Rockets frequently explode in the streets and blow people to bits. The worst part is that the government is always watching everything people do. There are these posters of Big Brother, who's supposedly the leader of the government, that say, "Big Brother is watching you." There are thought police who have hidden cameras and microphones literally everywhere. The government can watch you in your home through your TV screen, and you're not allowed to turn your TV off ever. There are a lot of things you're not allowed to do in this society, and if you do them, the police might take you away and throw you into a forced labor camp. You're not allowed to have close friends. You're not allowed to be in love. You can't date or have sex with someone you like. You're basically supposed to save all your emotional energy for the party being the government. Then there are things you have to do. You have to watch the government programming on TV, most of its news, some of its exercises. You have to attend pep rallies, including this one called the 2 Minutes Hate. So it's hard to even have time to think your own thoughts because they're constantly filling your head with propaganda. The main character of 1984 is Winston Smith. He's 39, he has a job in the government, and he lives this horrible, dreary existence without any friends or anyone in his life. At the beginning of the book, he starts writing a diary to talk about how much he hates life in his society, even though writing a diary is one of those things you'd be killed for doing if you were caught. The diary is his place for thinking about his society. It's a place where he tries to imagine if life could possibly be different from the way it is. There's no way for him to know if things were ever different before, because the government has changed all the records of the past and rewritten all the history books. At the beginning of the novel, there are two other people who matter to Winston, and he doesn't even know either of them. One of them is Julia. Julia is this attractive young woman who works in the same building as him. She's some kind of mechanic. Winston basically hates her. He hates her because she's pretty and he can't have her, but he also thinks she's the sort of person who would turn him into the thought police. So he's afraid of her, but also sort of fascinated. The other person he's interested in is this portly guy named O'Brien, who's a member of the inner party. That means he's a boss, much higher up than Winston. Winston should be afraid of this guy, but he gets the sense that O'Brien is intelligent, so he has this yearning to be friends with him. He thinks O'Brien would understand how he feels about life. The book takes a turn one day when Julia slips Winston a note that says, "I love you." This note completely rocks Winston's world. Of course he's interested. He can't wait to get in touch with her. But it's very hard for them to say 2 words to each other in private with all these spies and cameras everywhere. Finally, they do manage to get out to the country, and they start this mad love affair. The love affair makes them both very happy. It's dangerous because they could be killed or sent to labor camps if they get caught, but that makes it more exciting. At last, Winston has someone who understands him and who hates the party as much as he does. But Winston needs to go that extra step. He's rebelling against the party privately by having the secret affair. Now he wants to go to the next level and be an active rebel against the government. He gets his chance one day when O'Brien invites him to his apartment to look at something work-related. Winston takes a leap of faith and guesses that O'Brien must be part of the rebellion, because no one invites people over to their home. It just isn't done. So he and Julia go to O'Brien's house and confess that they want to be rebels. And O'Brien says, "Yes, I'm a rebel too." And we all read this book that explains why things are the way they are. Winston reads the book, and he's blown away by it. Unfortunately, right after he reads it, the thought police bust in and arrest him and Julia and carry them off to the Ministry of Love to torture them. So we learned that O'Brien wasn't a rebel after all. He just wanted to catch Winston. In the Ministry of Love, they torture Winston in all sorts of horrible ways. They break his bones and his teeth, they use electric shock, they starve him, and on and on. He tells them everything he knows, he confesses to everything they ask him, and he tells them everything he knows about Julia. After torturing him over and over, O'Brien finally tells Winston what it is that the government really wants. What they want is to have total power over the minds of people like Winston. They want people like Winston to say 2 + 2 = 5 and really believe it, not just say it to avoid a beating. For the government, it's purely an exercise in power. They're not trying to control his mind for some other purpose. They just want to exercise total power over people's minds. They finally do break Winston completely in this place called Room 101, where they do whatever it is you're most afraid of. They lock his face into a cage and threaten to let these rats eat their way through his face. He has a phobia of rats, so he loses it and says, "Do it to Julia, not me," which is a complete betrayal of what's most important to him. The government has taken his last shred of integrity. After he does that, they let him and Julia go. the thought police don't care about them anymore. The two of them meet on the outside, but they can't love each other anymore. Winston and Julia are basically broken people after they get out. Winston has changed to the point that he doesn't even want to think about anything that might be rebellious. He just sits in a cafe listening to the news and smiling. The last words of the novel are, "He loved Big Brother." So, one of the points the book makes is that a human being can be broken down completely until he'll believe whatever you tell him, even if it's that 2 + 2 = 5. At the same time, the book has a positive message, which is that it's really hard to get inside someone's head to that extent. The government has to go to incredible lengths to brainwash Winston successfully.
Okay, that's it for me for this week. I'll be back next week. It's Free Association, 11 o'clock Studio B. And thanks for listening. Thanks for being around. Thanks for sharing the chat room. Come down and support the station if you can. Revolution.radio. Make a regular donation if you can. See you next.
Thank you for listening to Revolution